Rome trembled, not because of swords, but because of a question. Who is Jesus, an exalted creature or the eternal God? Two names rose like storms, Arius and Athanasius. If they were wrong, millions would be shipwrecked in faith. Today we open the case that set an empire ablaze. Stay until the end. You may know the Council of Nicaea as a distant chapter, but it was there that the very heart of the faith was decided. Is Christ a created being or God himself made flesh? Arius stirred crowds with sharp logic. Athanasius endured exiles to defend the mystery. This video is not a cold lecture. It is a courtroom, an arena, and a whisper of danger, where each sentence can topple an altar or save a soul. If topics like this move you, subscribe now to the Faith and Power channel and turn on the bell. I want to know where you're watching from. Write your city and country in the comments. Buckle up. We're about to reconstruct the showdown that shook Rome and the Christian world. Share this episode with someone who needs this courage. The port of Alexandria bustled with the noise of ships, the smell of fish and spices, the shouts of merchants, and the murmur of students debating philosophy in shaded courtyards. It was a city where the air itself seemed charged with intellectual gunpowder. In the midst of this cauldron, a priest with a deep voice and piercing gaze began to draw crowds. His name, Arius. Tall, thin, dressed with an almost ascetic simplicity, he spoke as if cutting with an invisible blade. Arius was no ordinary rebel. He had the gift of logic, the discipline of an ascetic, and the skill of a general on the battlefield of ideas. When preaching, he did not shout. His words fell like stones cast into the lake of conscience. There was a time when the sun did not exist, he would say, and each syllable of that sentence seemed like an arrow striking at orthodoxy. The city split like a stormy sea. On one side, those who saw in Arius a restorer of biblical purity, freeing Christianity from Greek superstitions. On the other, those who perceived in his doctrine a deadly poison, ready to corrode the very essence of the faith. Among the latter, a young deacon, still without the weight of episcopal authority but already burning with the fire of a prophet, began to stand out: Athanasius. Athanasius was no man for half measures. His dark eyes carried the intensity of someone who refused to retreat. For him, denying the full divinity of Christ was like tearing the heart out of the gospel. Without the eternal Word made flesh, there could be no redemption capable of reaching humanity to the very bone of its existence. Alexandria became an arena. The taverns discussed the same issues as the lecture halls. Sailors repeated in thick accents theological phrases they didn't always understand, but which inflamed tempers. The issue was no longer confined to the clergy. It was now in the people's blood. Patriarch Alexander, head of the local church, tried to contain the storm. He called meetings, urged moderation, and asked for silence until a consensus could be reached. But Arius would not back down. He continued to teach that the Son was a sublime creature, greater than all others, yet still created. To him, calling Jesus eternal was to rob the Father of his exclusive title as without beginning. The debates turned into songs. Yes, songs. Arius's followers adapted popular melodies to spread his doctrine. Fishermen and grain sellers sang theological refrains in the streets, spreading the controversy like fire through dry straw. No walls could contain a hymn repeated by drunken sailors and curious children. Athanasius, watchful, saw the danger advance. It was not enough to refute Arius with cold reasoning. Hearts needed to be set ablaze. So he began to write, to argue, to visit communities. He spoke of a Christ who did not merely come from God, but who was God himself descending to rescue humanity from darkness. Meanwhile, rumors reached imperial corridors. Constantine, newly converted and still learning to navigate the murky waters of theology, heard of this dispute with growing unease. An empire unified under the cross could not afford to be divided over a single letter. And yet, one letter, or rather the essence it carried, threatened to shatter that unity. Alexandria endured sleepless nights, secret meetings, hurried letters, monks descending from the deserts to support one side or the other. At the docks, the wind carried more than salt and seaweed. It carried the scent of war, not of steel, but of arguments that could redefine centuries. Father Arius, with his calm voice and relentless logic, seemed as steady as rock. Athanasius, young and aflame, sharpened his words like arrows for the dawn. The city awaited the next move. What was at stake was not just an academic debate. It was the very face of Christ that would be either recognized or disfigured for generations to come. On the horizon, the shadow of a council began to grow. But for now, Alexandria was the battlefield, where it all began, and where no one would emerge unscathed. The May sun bathed the columns and mosaics of the city of Nicaea as envoys arrived from all corners of the empire. Dust-covered horsemen, bishops in worn robes, and scribes carrying scrolls of parchment filled the streets. There was an air of expectation and unease. Never before had a Roman emperor summoned such a vast council to resolve a matter of faith. Constantine, robed in imperial purple, was not merely a spectator. For him, doctrinal unity was as vital as the walls that guarded his borders. The emperor knew well the consequences of division. Civil wars had torn Rome apart more than any barbarian invasion ever had. Now, a theological dispute threatened the peace he had won at such great cost. The meeting hall was inside the imperial palace. Walls adorned with tapestries, tables covered with papyri, guards posted at the entrances. At the center stood a low throne, symbolizing that here the emperor did not rule alone, but alongside something greater, at least in theory. More than 300 bishops and church leaders took their seats. Some bore scars from past persecutions, reminders of a time when confessing Christ cost both body and blood. Arius entered with the composure of a man convinced of his truth. He walked through hostile gazes as though crossing a minefield, yet without losing his stride. His voice would echo in the debates, and he knew it. This was not only about theology, it was about his honor, his ministry, and the fate of his followers. Athanasius, though not yet a bishop, accompanied Patriarch Alexander as assistant and advisor. He sat nearby, attentive to every word, ready to step in whenever needed. For him, the dispute was no matter of semantics. It was the line that separated light from darkness. The debate began with readings from Scripture, followed by interpretations. Arius argued that the Son, though divine in glory, was created by the Father, and therefore not eternal. He cited passages that spoke of the Son as the firstborn of all creation, insisting this implied a beginning in time. The defenders of Christ's full divinity countered with the prologue of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Athanasius, impassioned, insisted that if Christ were not eternal, he could not offer eternal salvation. Constantine, seated with composed posture, intervened occasionally, not to define doctrine, but to maintain order. His gaze swept the room, like that of a commander surveying a battlefield. He knew that without consensus, imperial authority itself would be tarnished. The turning point came with a single word, homoousios, of the same substance. For the defenders of orthodoxy, this term described the relationship between the Father and the Son as fully equal in divine essence. For Arius and his supporters, it was a dangerous word, not found literally in Scripture and tainted with the flavor of Greek philosophy. The debate erupted into verbal combat. Bishops pounded their fists on tables, parchments were waved like banners, and tension rose like smoke over an altar about to ignite. Some accounts say that one bishop, enraged by Arius's words, tore a manuscript to pieces before them all. Days turned into weeks. The Palace of Nicaea became a maze of meetings, alliances, and negotiations. Constantine, realizing unity had to be sealed, backed the homoousios formula. For many, it was not only a theological act, but also a political one. The victory of one creed meant the defeat of the other, and with it, the exile of its adherents. When the final creed was read, declaring that the Son is true God from true, God begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father, the room split between relief and outrage. Arius refused to sign. His defiance sealed his fate. When Nicaea was left behind, the empire had an official creed, but it also bore an open wound that would not easily heal. In many hearts, the battle was far from over, and in the shadows, voices were already preparing to keep the flame of controversy alive. The great hall of Nicaea might have emptied, but the echo of one word still resonated across the empire: homoousios. Only a single letter separated it from homoousios. The first proclaimed that the Son was of the same substance as the Father, the second of similar substance. To untrained eyes, a minimal difference. To hearts aflame, the dividing line between eternal truth and soul-destroying heresy. Arius and his supporters did not concede defeat. The loss at the council did not erase their conviction that homoousios was a treacherous term, drenched in pagan philosophy and alien to biblical language. In letters sent in secret, he denounced this formula as one that opened the door to confusing Father and Son, dissolving the divine hierarchy. Athanasius, now emboldened by the outcome of Nicaea, saw in homoousios not merely a choice of words, but the wall that would keep the faith from being dragged into disguised idolatry. Without that absolute equality, Christ would cease to be the God who saves, and would become just another exalted creature. The battle, however, had changed its ground. It was no longer fought in palace chambers, but on parchments, in sermons, and in whispered conversations on street corners. The streets of Antioch, Caesarea, and Jerusalem became arenas where monks, merchants, and soldiers repeated Greek terms with the same passion they spoke of taxes or wars. An elderly monk from Cappadocia would later recount that he had never seen men fight so fiercely over a single letter. He recalled two sailors nearly killing each other on the docks, one defending that Christ was equal in essence to the Father, the other shouting that he was only similar. The disputes left marks not only on the mind, but on the body. Emperor, who had dreamed of peace, began to realize that Nicaea's decision had produced as much poison as it had remedy. Advisors close to Arius whispered that the homoousios formula created needless divisions. Some bishops, influential and shrewd, approached the imperial throne with promises of reconciliation, provided that certain exiles were pardoned and the language of the creed softened. Athanasius was not blind to these maneuvers. His letters to the faithful burned with warning against wolves in sheep's clothing seeking to tear down what had been built at such great cost. For him, yielding in language would open the door for the entire faith to be subtly, almost imperceptibly, redefined. The Arian party struck back with equal force. They accused the defenders of homoousios of betraying the simplicity of the gospel, and of imposing philosophical terms foreign to the faith. Each side accused the other of twisting the truth and serving hidden agendas. In Constantinople, a rumor spread. The emperor was considering reinstating Arius. The news struck like lightning among the defenders of Nicaea. To them, it was not merely a political reversal. It was the threat of seeing the very imperial creed watered down. Tensions reached a new peak when, under pressure from influential figures, Constantine allowed Arius to return to Alexandria. The streets that once rang with anti-Arian chants now swelled with whispers and fears. Some said Arius would come back with a conciliatory spirit. Others foresaw an even fiercer storm. The defenders of orthodoxy saw the situation as a supreme test. Winning a council was not enough. They had to hold the victory on the treacherous field of politics and influence. And in that arena, Arius had dangerous and strategic allies. While cities argued over letters and substances, something deeper was at stake. The very way the empire would unite cross and crown. A doctrinal decision did not remain confined to the altar. It echoed in the legions, in the laws, and in political alliances. Thus, that single letter, a simple Greek iota, became both sword and wall, opening wounds that showed no sign of healing. And both Arius and Athanasius knew that, as long as breath remained, the dispute would never be laid to rest. The imperial decree arrived like a silent blade. Athanasius, patriarch of Alexandria, was to leave the city immediately. There was no public trial, no chance for defense. The orders came from Constantinople, stamped with the authority of Constantine, and sharpened by the influence of Arius's allies. It was the beginning of a dangerous dance, where politics moved faster than theology. Athanasius's departure was anything but discreet. Monks, clergy, and loyal citizens accompanied him to the port, weeping and chanting psalms. For them, the bishop's removal was not a mere administrative change. It was a sign that the city stood on the brink of surrendering to heresy. The waters of the Mediterranean, which had so often carried goods and pilgrims, now bore the most. Steadfast defender of the Nicene Creed into exile. Meanwhile, Arius was regaining ground. He did not return as a warrior thirsting for revenge, but as a teacher who believed he had weathered the storm and now sailed under favorable winds. His supporters seized every opportunity to present his doctrine as simpler, more faithful to Scripture and more capable of uniting an empire weary of division. But the streets of Alexandria were not easily won. Many remembered the council and clung to the creed like an anchor. Small clashes broke out in the squares, and the name of Christ, instead of uniting, became a banner for opposing sides. Athanasius, in exile, was far from idle. He wrote fiery letters, warning that heresy was spreading like leprosy and that his removal was the result of conspiracy. These letters, copied and carried by monks, crossed deserts and seas, reaching communities that still regarded him as their true shepherd, even from afar. The imperial court, in turn, became a chessboard where bishops, eunuchs, and generals moved their pieces. The emperor heard conflicting advice. Some claimed that keeping Athanasius away was essential for peace. Others warned that prolonged exile could spark new religious uprisings. Constantine, ever pragmatic, tried to balance the scales, but the balance was as unstable as a vase on a slanted floor. The emperor's death did not end the dispute. On the contrary, it opened the way for new rulers to impose their own theological preferences. Emperors sympathetic to Arius convened synods to reinterpret the creed. Those aligned with Athanasius restored the original formula and called the bishop back. Thus, Athanasius endured an almost endless cycle of expulsions and returns, exiled 5 times over the course of his life. Each exile was different. There were periods when he took refuge among desert monks, living in caves, surviving on bread and water, and writing treatises that would become theological weapons for generations. At other times, he sought shelter in distant cities, always surrounded by believers willing to risk themselves to protect him. On the Arian side, the strategy was patient. They did not try to topple everything at once, but to erode convictions. Slowly, changing terms, rewriting formulas, weakening the authority of their opponents. They knew that in matters of religion, popular fatigue could be as powerful as any argument. The squares, once filled with singing, now echoed with cautious murmurs. People began to fear speaking openly, never certain which party held the imperial blessing at any given moment. And the empire, always alert to stability, preferred silence to inflamed conviction. For Athanasius, every return to Alexandria was both a triumphal entry and a grim warning. He knew he could be forced to leave again at any moment. For Arius and his successors, every political advance was cause for celebration, but also a reminder that the opposition would never give up. Thus, between exiles and retaliations, the empire pulled the strings of a dispute that, beneath the appearance of theology, concealed power games, temporary alliances, and calculated betrayals. And in the shadows of the throne, both Arians and Nicenes awaited the next turn of fate. Long before theologians refined arguments on parchment, faith was already pulsing in the alleys, marketplaces, and banks of the Nile. Alexandria was not only the seat of a powerful patriarchate, but also home to fervent communities where every hymn sung could be a manifesto. The people had long memories and fiery hearts, and in the conflict between Arius and Athanasius, this popular energy became a decisive force. The desert monks, stern figures with sun-scorched skin and eyes sharpened by discipline, appeared as both messengers and spiritual soldiers. Living far from the noise of the cities, they nonetheless kept a watchful ear on the church's disputes. When they perceived a threat to the faith they professed, they would descend in silent groups, like a storm heralded only by the wind. In Nicaea, Alexandria, the presence of these monks stirred opposing reactions. To some, they were holy defenders, living signs of purity resisting imperial corruption. To others, they were sparks, ready to ignite unrest. Their arrival at the docks often coincided with days of verbal and physical confrontations in the streets. Popular songs continued to be a powerful weapon. Arius's followers adapted cheerful melodies to spread his ideas, while Athanasius's defenders responded with psalms exalting Christ as the eternal God. Children learned the lyrics before they even understood the concepts, perpetuating messages that would shape their understanding of faith. Athanasius, always aware of symbolic power, maintained close ties with monastic leaders. Often meeting them in remote places, he would ask for prayers and report on the state of the city. These spiritual alliances sustained him during exile, ensuring that even far away, his influence still echoed. Tension between the people and the authorities grew whenever imperial orders tried to impose changes on the liturgy or the language of sermons. Certain preachers, avoiding the term homoousios to please the authorities, saw their churches empty. Conversely, those who proclaimed it openly drew large crowds, and often the watchful eyes of soldiers. The docks served as a thermometer. Sailors traveling between Constantinople, Antioch, and Rome brought not only goods, but also charged accounts of arrests, councils, and exiles. Each story, retold in taverns, took on bolder colors, feeding the atmosphere of conspiracy. There were days when tension spilled over. Reports speak of processions that, upon crossing paths in the streets, turned into improvised battlegrounds. Stones and sticks replaced arguments, and blood ran across the cobblestones. Faith, so often proclaimed as the bond of peace, became a banner of war. The monks also served as guardians of documents and letters. When theological treatises were at risk of confiscation, it was they who, hiding parchments under their robes, crossed deserts and seas to preserve them. Many of Athanasius's works survived because calloused hands and bare feet braved dangerous roads to carry them. For the empire, this popular and monastic mobilization was a constant challenge. Convincing. Bishops was not enough. Hearts also had to be won, and inflamed hearts do not easily yield to decrees. Local governors tried to negotiate, alternating threats and promises, but loyalty to a vision of Christ proved stronger than any coin or position. Arius, for his part, also knew how to speak to the people. His simple way of life, his direct speech, his measured chanting during liturgies attracted many who saw in him a close shepherd. Unlike leaders who seemed distant and pompous, This human connection kept his doctrine alive even when he faced official resistance. At nightfall, Alexandria's alleys held secrets. In modest homes, groups gathered to read letters sent by exiles or to sing forbidden hymns. Each meeting was a calculated risk, but also an act of resistance. The echo of psalms and Arian chants mingled in the wind, like voices refusing to be silenced, and as long as the people kept their flame burning, no imperial decree could end the dispute. The battlefield was not only in the palaces, it blazed in the hearts that, united or divided, would never stop singing. The story could have ended with Nicaea, but it didn't. Not even the deaths of Arius and Athanasius silenced the echo of their voices. Emperors came and went, each tipping the theological scales in their own way. Some favored the Nicene Creed. Others leaned toward softer formulas that allowed Arians to keep their place at both altar and court. In the final days of his life, Constantine was baptized by a bishop with Arian leanings, a gesture many saw as a betrayal of the defenders of Homousios. His successors inherited not only a throne, but also a doctrinal war that infiltrated military alliances, diplomatic treaties, and even the borders themselves. What was at stake was no longer just the definition of Christ, but the very relationship between faith and imperial power. An emperor could, with a single edict, change the creed recited in every church of the empire, and an exiled bishop could, with a well-crafted letter, spark silent uprisings in distant regions. Athanasius, even after multiple exiles, died steadfast in his confession. To his followers, he became a symbol of resistance against both political and spiritual tyranny. His life inspired monks, preachers, and lay people who saw doctrinal fidelity as fidelity to God above any Caesar. Arius, though he died before witnessing the empire ultimately lean toward the Nicene Creed, left behind skilled disciples. They kept the Arian flame alive for decades, adapting its message, exploiting political openings, and taking advantage of changes in leadership to resurface on the public stage. The councils that followed, held in various cities, sometimes confirmed and sometimes softened Nicaea's language. Terms were swapped, formulas rewritten, but the tension remained. It was like an underground fire, hidden from sight, yet ready to burst forth whenever favorable winds blew. For the people, these constant changes bred uncertainty. Many no longer knew which formula was the true one at any given moment. Some withdrew from the debates, focusing instead on prayer and community life. Others, however, embraced the dispute as inseparable from their faith, prepared to defend their position to the end. The empire, for its part, had learned that controlling theology also meant controlling politics. Creeds could unite or divide. Legions influence loyalties and determine alliances. Behind the palace's closed doors, advisors discussed doctrine with the same fervor they planned military campaigns. There was something deeper still, the awareness that the definition of Christ shaped the very identity of the Christian world. If he was fully God, salvation was the direct work of the Creator descending into the dust to redeem man. If he was a creature, however exalted, the gap between God and humanity remained, and the bridge of redemption was left incomplete. Centuries later, the controversy would be remembered as one of the Church's great turning points. Nicaea did more than formulate a creed. It set the precedent that the empire could intervene in, shape, and even decide theological matters. That lesson, for better or worse, would echo into the Middle Ages and beyond. Looking back, Arius and Athanasius were more than rivals. They were symbols of two ways of understanding not only Christ, but also the relationship between truth and power. One upheld the absolute transcendence of God and the uniqueness of Christ as a singular creation. The other affirmed that the Son was eternal like the Father, an unshakable foundation for salvation. Between them, Caesars and councils took turns as both arbiters and players, weaving faith and politics into one fabric. And when the dust of battle finally settled, it became clear that, although one creed had prevailed, the memory of the dispute would never fade, for there are wars that end on the battlefield and others that stretch across centuries. The war of Arius and Athanasius belongs to the latter, a wound and a flame still burning in history, a reminder that words can be sharper than swords and more enduring than empires. The clash between Arius and Athanasius did not end with the signing of the Nicene Creed. It crossed decades, crossed thrones, crossed seas. What began as a theological dispute became a political, cultural, and spiritual battlefield. Nicaea proclaimed, "Christ is true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father." Athanasius defended these words with his very life, facing exiles, threats, and intrigues. For him, it was not a matter of intellectual pride, but of salvation. If the Son were not eternal, he could not save eternally. Arius, though officially defeated, left a persistent legacy. His vision, shaped by logic and biblical simplicity, lived on in disciples who knew how to navigate the tides of politics. The empire sought unity, but discovered that when the throne shapes the altar, faith risks becoming a tool of power. Nicaea did not merely answer the question, "Who is Jesus?" It showed that the answer would shape borders, alliances, and the destiny of millions. The people did not watch from afar. They sang, protested, fought. Desert monks guarded parchments and traveled to support exiled leaders. Sailors carried news and hymns from port to port. Centuries later, the confrontation remains a mirror. It reminds us that deep truths demand courage, and that theology, however lofty, always touches everyday life. You are watching Faith and Power. If this story spoke to your heart, subscribe now and turn on the bell. Write your city and country in the comments. Share this video with someone who loves history and values faith, because empires pass away, but the truth, like the one Athanasius defended against winds and seas, remains.